3 Stories of Survival. 15 Minutes with a Cyclone, a True Story by M. Lewis Ford. Speaking of cyclones, remarked Mr. Wilson to the company about the library fire one cold November evening, I think I can equal any story you have told with my own experience in a genuine twister. As he had already heard some surprising stories, a general exclamation from the young and old demanded the story, and after a little arguing, Mr. Wilson began. We were living then, my wife and 8 children, of whom the youngest was about 4 months old, in Malcolm, a pretty little village about 5 miles from the city of Grinnell, Iowa. The farm was as attractive as it could well be. Acre after acre of rolling prairie land, a fine garden, and a young thriving orchard. My cousin had lived on the place for several years, but when his business made it necessary to go farther west, he had persuaded me to come out and take the farm. I had hoped to go west for several years, and I thought this an excellent opportunity, so we moved out and had been living there about 4 years when the big blow came. It was in 1882, on the 27th of June. You will see why I have no trouble in remembering the date. It had been an exceedingly hot day, not a cloud to be seen, with the sun beating fiercely down, and not a breath of air stirring. We sat out on the porch after supper, trying to find a cool place. The clouds were beginning to gather, and it looked as if there might be a shower. The 3 little ones went early to bed, and in spite of the oppressive heat, were soon fast asleep. It couldn't have been far more than 8 o'clock when I heard a sound, which I at first thought was thunder. The others noticed it too, and as it grew louder, a terrible rushing sound came with it. And we looked at one another in silence for a minute, and then ran to where we could look westward. My heart almost stopped beating. Then I saw coming towards us with terrific speed a black funnel-shaped cloud, the rush and roar accompanying it growing louder every minute. "Run for the cellar!" I cried. My wife ran and seized the baby, and I caught up the 2 other children from bed. There was no time to lose. The one who first reached the cellar door, it was one of the older children, had just time to seize the knob, nothing more, and then crash! Such a terrific noise. I felt myself lifted in the air, and thought my time had come. The next thing I knew, I felt the splash of cold water in my face. I must have lost consciousness, but the water revived me, and in a moment I knew where I was. I had come down head first in the well. The water was some 10 feet deep. I was thoroughly at home in the water, though I wasn't used to diving in that fashion. I managed to right myself and came up head first. The well was not more than 3 feet across, and the pump had been broken short off and carried away, leaving a 2-inch iron pipe standing straight up in the middle. I was very nearly out of breath when I came to the top of the water. My hands touched something floating on the surface. I thought it was the cat. Imagine my surprise when I found it was Charlie, our 5-year-old boy. He was terribly frightened, and as amazed as I was to find myself not alone in the well. The wonder was that we were not both of us impaled on this iron pipe. How he escaped it, I cannot understand. The cyclone had passed on, a terrific steady wind was blowing, and I could hear it roar above our heads, and by the flashes of lightning I could see that rain fell in torrents. We were both so wet we didn't mind the little extra water that splashed down on us, and as soon as possible I raised Charlie to my shoulders, and by aid of the pipe managed to work my way up to the top of the well. This took some little time, and the wind and rain had nearly ceased when I set my feet on solid earth again, and found we were unhurt. But such a scene as I looked upon I hope never to see again, and I dreaded to look about me for fear of worse things. Evidently the house had been lifted bodily from its foundations and dashed down. Everything that had not been carried away by the wind lay about the yard. Many of the great timbers were found rods away, driven into the earth, as if it had been tent pegs. Soon I heard my wife's voice calling, and I was happy when I found her and two of our little ones, terribly wet and frightened, but unhurt. But where was the baby? I called the name of the other children. As we ran frantically here and there to find some trace of them, Nellie, the eldest, came running from the orchard with the baby in her arms. She said she had picked him up from the wet ground where he was laying, and he had not even cried. She had found herself there, but that was all she knew about it. Indeed, none of us could give any account of our wandering after we left the cellar door. Soon we heard the boys' voices and found that they were in the cellar. The cyclone, in lifting the body of the house, had taken up a part of the foundation, which was of large stone laid in cement, and then dropped it. The floor came down a little askew, and a stove, an organ, and a heavy desk had slidden off into the cellar. In some way or other the boys reached the cellar, too, probably before the floor fell, for the flooring made a protection over their heads. They came out safe and sound, though it was difficult to set them free. It seems that my wife had found herself on the ground, and by the flashes of lightning had seen Charlie standing not far from her. As the wind was blowing a gale, she called to him to lie down flat on the ground, but the next time the lightning came she could not see him. Suppose the wind must have swept him off his feet into the well. Providentially I was there to rescue him. Well, we found ourselves all safe and unhurt, except a few slight bruises not worthy of mentioning, after what we had been through. And you can understand that we were not only a very happy family, but that we were a very thankful family too. Our home was scattered along on the prairie for a mile or more. There wasn't enough left of it to make a large hen house. The barn was gone also, but to our surprise there stood the 30 head of cattle tied to the stanchions. Only one of them was killed. The big wagon was in the yard and had in some way escaped destruction, so we hitched up the horses and started to find shelter. Our clothing was rather the worse for wear, but we did not stop to think about trifles. We could see the terrible work of the cyclone as we rode along, trees twisted off or torn up by the roots, and buildings demolished. The rain had come down in such torrents, and the next day the trees and fences looked as if there had been a high tide, and leaves and straws, which clung to them, a foot or more above the ground, showing at what height the water had stood. Waterspouts at Sea by J.O. Davidson. Who has not noticed during a sultry summer afternoon the little whirlwind in the middle of the dusty road, caused by two breezes coming down street that came together? First there will be seen a column of light dust revolving upward. Next, moving here and there, it picks up stray bits of paper and leaves. Then, as its whirling grows stronger and covers more ground, it adds to its strange collection of objects small sticks and tufts of grass. At last away it goes, whirling and dancing its elfin waltz, until some immovable object interferes with its freedom of movement, and when, like a spoiled child, it ceases its wild play, the whirling stops, and poof! Down came the sticks and leaves and paper and whirlwind. In the western states, the same kind of whirlwinds grow to such proportion that through the thickest forests great tracks are mowed as it cuts by a giant scythe. But these big storms very appropriately receive the more dignified names of tornadoes. On the ocean These whirlwinds or tornadoes have, of course, not dust or trees to toss about in their giant hands, so they seize upon and suck up the water as the only plaything they can find, and twisting it into a long glittering rope of trembling liquid, lifts it up to the clouds, whence it is soon dispersed, again in the form of rain. When performing such an antic as these, the whirlwind or tornado is known as a waterspout. The ship's crew, which has so patiently steered its craft by treacherous rocks or dangerous shoals, and through all kinds of storms and stress at sea, is often confronted by new and unexpected danger. The waterspout, it most often makes its appearance beneath a black and lowering sky, but sometimes they start up mysteriously in clear weather to move along the ocean's rim in odd, fantastic attitudes, looking all the world like captive balloons dancing up and down and tugging at their ropes, now near the sea and now near the sky. In the Straits of Malacca and among the many islands in China Sea, they are greatly dreaded by the peaceful fishermen, who must often pull up anchor and race for the shore to avoid the unwelcome approaches of these giddy visitors, who fly hither and yon at their own sweet will, minus rudder or pilot. I have seen a waterspout make for a large fleet of rice junks, and the scattering of the odd-looking crafts under their brown sails and dashing sweeps, looking comically like the flight of a flock of startled quail. Sometimes a spout can be broken by the firing of a cannon close by, and then the singular spectacle will often be presented of the upper half of it going up into the cloud, while the lower part subsides into the sea. As most Chinese junks carry a number of guns and gongs, the waterspout often gets the worst of it in the uproar that is certain to salute one. The great four-masted American sailing ship Shenandoah, while coming home from Liverpool one time, had a lively experience with the waterspout. When within 500 miles of Sandy Hook, the wind suddenly changed. A great bank of clouds just ahead parted, and there, coming down, driven before the gale, appeared 6 great waterspouts, all at one time. One rushed by, just clearing the bowsprit and head sails by a few yards. Another came at her amidships, threatening to carry the mainmast away, and the captain just avoided by quickly turning the ship towards and around it. There were 2 more near ones, and as they were too close to run away from, the big ship was luffed up and steered right between them. The ship was saved, but what her fate would have been had she been struck by one can only be imagined from the captain's description of the waterspout that passed astern. He says it seemed to be fully 20 feet in diameter, and of solid water reaching to the clouds. During the same month, the steamer Piquia had a still more uncomfortable experience with these wandering giants of the ocean, near the Bermuda Islands. There she met a cyclone, upon whose outer edge there hung a great number of spouts, all dancing and pirouetting here and there, twisting and turning and balancing to partners, as if engaging in an elephantine quadrangle. The captain became bewildered, for whichever way he turned his steamer, he was headed off by the surrounding waterspouts. At last, just as he imagined he had steamed safely away, 2 of them made a rush, headed him off, and struck the starboard side of the steamer's iron bow, and with a tremendous blow. Then there was a commotion indeed. The broken columns of water dropped in tons on the forward deck, smashing the pilot-house and bridge ladder. tearing down 13 ventilators and dashing to the deck 2 sailors badly wounded. The ship staggered and rolled as the weight of the water poured over her sides in a Niagara of foam and spray, and for some time she could make no headway. While the 2 spouts were having their frolic with the sorely beset steamer, the others were whirling about as if dancing in glee at the commotion they had caused. From the black clouds above there shot down blinding streaks of lightning, which, although they missed the ship, so filled the air about her with electricity that it settled upon the metal tips of all the spares, and glowing and sparking there steadily with a beautiful light known as St. Elmo's fire. Imprisoned in a Mine by Caroline Abbott Stanley. It was the hour for the 3 o'clock shift. The half-dozen men gathered in the shaft house of the Bon Air mine went, one by one, to the box of candles. Each put 4 candles in the pocket of his rubber coat and stood by the shaft. The bell clanged. They stepped inside the cage. The engineer lowered them into the depths of the earth. As they dropped slowly down the shaft, a bulge in the timbers caught the eye of one of the men. "That place will make trouble some day," he said. "Why don't they fix it?" asked a young fellow of 19 or 20, Bert Frayne by name. "It costs money to re-timber mines." "But it is dangerous," he persisted. A man beside him gave a harsh laugh. "The danger is to the men, not the company. So what do they care?" "I guess they care something for the lives of their men," said the youth indignantly. "They don't care, I can tell you. You're a green boy. They don't care for nothing but the almighty dollar. You and me might drop to the bottom of this here shaft, and the boss wouldn't stop to pick us up unless we was in the way of the ore cars." "I don't believe it." "You ain't living in this world as long as I have," responded Huyler grimly. "You'd know more if you had." "Better not know so much than to know so much that ain't so," retorted the young man. In the laugh that followed, the cage reached the 400-foot level. The men turned into the tunnel, going to work with pick and shovel. At the close of the working hour they stood at the shaft again, waiting to go up, the loaded cars beside them. "Say, boys," said an older miner, "if these cars go up now, some of us will have to wait till the next trip." "Go ahead," said Huyler. "I've got to go back for my coat anyway." Bert Frayne stepped off. "I'm in no hurry. I'll wait with Huyler." The cage rose slowly, and the 2 men walked back to the drift, where Huyler had been at work. They were returning leisurely when they heard a crash. They rushed to the shaft, expecting to see a fallen cage and 4 mangled men standing there, and there was nothing to be seen but a mass of earth and timbers. The shaft had caved in. They stared at it for a moment in silence. Then they turned ghastly faces toward each other. "Huyler!" The boy stepped close to the man and spoke in half-whisper. "Surely they'll get us out." The man shook his head. "They can't. That shaft may be half full." "But we can help. We can shovel the dirt into the cars, and we can run them back into the tunnel and empty them, and if they dig from the top—" Huyler interrupted him. "How long do you suppose we can shovel dirt and lift timbers without anything to eat?" The younger man was silent. "How long would it take them to clean out the shaft? Supposin' it was half full?" he asked. "Long'n me and you'd hold out," said Huyler with the calmness of despair. "No, boy, we're dead men, caught like rats in a trap." Then he cursed the company and their own unhappy fate. "Huyler," said Bert at last, "they certainly will not leave us here to die. They'll put all hands at work and dig us out, surely." "They don't know we're alive, I tell you. We were standing right by the shaft. They'll think we're dead now." Despair was settling down upon the older man, but youth is always hopeful. "I'm gonna dig," said Bert. He found an empty ore car, and working with the energy of desperation. "Come on, Hyler! Don't let's give up!" Momentarily strengthened by his companion's courage, Hyler took his shovel and began to work. He laid it down in a few minutes. "'Tain't no use, boy," he said. "Might as well try to dip Salt Lake dry with a tin cup." But Bert worked on. He stopped at last, overcome with exhaustion. He could hardly see that he had made an impression. Then the full horror of their situation came upon him, and he sank to the ground. "If they could only know that we're alive," he groaned. "Perhaps they could do something." His shovel fell from his grasp and struck against the iron water pipe, making a sharp clang. The sound fell upon a brain growing benumbed, and electrified it. He sprang up excitedly. "Hyler! Hyler! We can let them know we are alive by the pipe. Don't you know the earth carries sound?" He was wild with joy at the thought of communicating with the world above. They rapped, then listened, then rapped again. No sound but their own labored breathing. "Harder, harder!" and they rained blows upon the heavy iron. The pipe was one used for draining the mine, and led directly to the shaft house above. Bert's hope was that someone might hear the rapping, and understand that they were alive. As the minutes went by, however, there was no answer and no signal. Hope turned to fear, and the fear to agonizing conviction that their signals had not been heard by those above. "It wouldn't do no good nohow," said Hyler, despondently. "We're bottled here, bound to starve before the shaft can be dug out." They fell back then against the wall of the tunnel and sat in silence. Bert thinking of life and all it had promised, Hyler thinking of his wife and children. How long they sat there they never knew. They had no watches, and no way of telling day from night. After a while, Hyler blew out his candle, muttering something about saving it, and Bert looked up with a frightened face. He went back to the drift and collected a lot of the old ends. It seemed they had been there for hours. When Hyler asked if he had matches, he felt in his pocket. "Yes, I have." "Blow out your light, then, and let's go to bed. We'll sleep all we can." They lay on the hard floor, their coats under their head, and tried to sleep. Then exhaustion overpowered them, and they dozed fitfully. But their sleep was a nightmare. From a horrid dream, Bert woke to a reality not far different. The darkness was insupportable, the silence such as chills. A cold sweat stood on his face in beads, and a shivering fell upon him. "Hyler," he whispered. Even in the extremity of his terror, he would not wake his companion if he were asleep. "What?" The man's gruff voice had softened strangely. "Oh, Hyler, have we got to die here in this hole?" "We're bound to, boy. There's no help." They lay there a few minutes in silence, and then Bert said brokenly, "Hyler, can you pray?" "No." There came into the boy's mind a far-off memory of, "Now I lay me down to sleep," but they did not seem exactly appropriate, and were unsaid. He did not know that the very turning of the soul in a mute cry for help was prayer. "Some are praying up there above," he said. There was a gleam of hope in the thought. "It won't do no good," responded Hyler gloomily. "You see, the trouble is they can't get us food, and we can't live on praying. Like enough they won't think of it now, he added after a moment. He did not know much about praying, but it was a straw, and he was a drowning man. "I know my mother will," Bert positively thought. "I believe your wife will." "I don't know as she knows how," Hyler spoke doubtfully. "She ain't had much time for prayin', and all things with the family and all." Then he sat up and said, with a little catch in his voice, "I tell you, boy, If I was out of this, I'd give her a different sort of life from the one she's had." Thus passed the long, long night away. They talked and dozed and dreamed, and woke to wish their sleep had never ended. Finally, worn out with it all, they fell into dreamless stupors of exhausted nerves. They were awakened by an explosion that brought them to their feet. It seemed as if the very walls were falling. Bert lighted his candle with shaking fingers. His companion followed by example, and the two men peered around them. There was nothing that they could see. The walls were as solid as ever, and they moved cautiously toward the mouth of the shaft, and doing so had to pass the water pipe. They lifted their candles above their heads and examined closely as they went. When they reached the pipe, they stopped. It was blown to pieces, and as they stared and wondered and speculated, they saw something emerging from its mouth. It was a weighted cord with a note tied to it. They tore it off frantically. It said, "Keep up courage, boys. We will let down food through the pipe, and in a few days we can get to you. The men are digging day and night. Tell us if you're hurt." They dropped to their knees and cried like babies, cried and laughed and wrung each other's hands. Oh, the joy of life, just life. Bert took the pencil and wrote, "We are all right, but awful hungry." They had not felt their hunger till now. "What day is it? How long have we been in? And how did you do it?" He fastened the note to a weight and gave the rope a jerk, and it was drawn up. Before long, a tin pail began to emerge from the pipe. It was filled with food. They emptied it quickly on the rubber coat, and it was drawn up, to reappear with a supply of candles and another note. They lighted 2 or 3 of the new candles, laughing hilariously at their illumination, and read, "We heard you tap on the pipe and knew you were alive. Then we set out our heads to work to get food to you. First we pumped out the water, and then we let down a light charge of dynamite in the pipe to just the right distance and set it off. Of course it burst the pipe, and now you are all right. Your wife's been at the shaft house all along, Huyler, and Bert's mother has been on her knees most of the night. I'll send you the morning paper. It tells all about the cave-in." "Huyler," said Bert, as he read the sentence about his mother, "I knew they would remember." It was not 3 days, the time predicted by the Daily Eagle, that they were entombed, but many. The opening of the old shaft was found to be imperceptible, and a new one was started. But the two men were in safety now, and comparative comfort. Food, lights, letters, and papers were lowered to them, and there, 400 feet below daylight, they read the story of the work for their rescue. They received and sent daily bulletins by the pipe. But the days lengthened to weeks before they were released, though the whole force was put upon the new shaft, and in half-hour relays. "The men are working hard," the newspaper said. On the 23rd day the work was completed, and the cage bearing the entombed men was lifted slowly into daylight. The shaft house was full, and as the men appeared a shout went up. The manager stood by the shaft and gave them each a hearty handshake. "Stand back, boys," he said, as the men crowded round. "You must let their women have a chance with them first." "Bert," said one of the men, a little later, when the handshaking was over and they still lingered, "what do you suppose it has cost to get you fellers out of there?" "I don't know what." They had hardly thought of the money spent to pay for the work of rescuing them. $3,000. I told the boss jokingly after it was all over that you wasn't worth it. But he got mad at that and said money had nothing to do with it, and that he'd save your lives if it busted the company. $3,000. The two men looked at each other's faces. Then Bert turned to the boss. "Hendricks is right, sir," he said. "We ain't worth it. in money to the company, but he looked up at the blue Colorado sky that he had thought he would never see again, and drew a long, free breath. Then he lifted his cap reverently, and Huyler took the heavy baby from his wife's tired arms. "Come, Lizzie, my girl," he said, with a gentleness new to him. "Let's take the baby home." The end. I hope you've enjoyed those stories. 2 of them at least I know are true. I'm not sure about the last one, which was written by a novelist, but it could have been based on a true story. It was very interesting. And these are stories written in a magazine long ago called the St. Nicholas Magazine. And thank you for listening to Miss Retro Reads.